At 3:47 in the morning local time, under skies Russian commanders had sworn were impenetrable, Ukrainian forces executed one of the most audacious deep strike operations of this entire war. More than 300 low-cost drones coordinated in layered swarms supported by precision-guided missiles penetrated over 1,000 kilometers into what Moscow had designated its strategic rear. The targets were Engels Air Base and Olenya Air Base, home to Russia's elite fleet of two 95 Bear and two 160 Blackjack strategic bombers. When the explosions rippled across those runways and hangars, the night sky turned into a literal firestorm. By dawn, at least 15 of those multi-million-dollar aircraft were either destroyed outright or damaged beyond immediate repair. Fuel depots burned. Command infrastructure was shattered. And the Kremlin's response? They didn't analyze the failure. They screamed cheated. But let me be crystal clear from the very first minute of this briefing. This was not cheating. This was not some shadowy NATO violation or unfair technology. What you witnessed in the last 48 hours is the inevitable consequence of Russia's doctrinal collapse meeting Ukraine's relentless adaptation. This is not a tactical incident. This is a systems-level verdict on why one side keeps winning the adaptation race while the other pays for assumptions that died on the battlefield months ago. Pull the lens back with me and you will see exactly why this operation changes everything. I spent decades commanding forces across Europe, studying exactly how armies move, how doctrines either evolve or die. And what I have been saying since the first weeks of this conflict is now playing out in real time with devastating clarity. Russia built its entire strategy on three fatal assumptions. First, that sheer distance would protect its strategic assets. Second, that layered air defense systems like the S-400 would create an impenetrable shield no matter how creative the attacker became. And third, that numerical superiority in heavy iron would always dictate the terms of battle. Those assumptions were never questioned in Moscow. They were gospel. And Ukraine has spent the last 3 years systematically dismantling every single one of them. Let that sink in for a moment. When this war began, Russian planners genuinely believed a short, decisive campaign would end it. They massed forces expecting Ukrainian resistance to crumble under the weight of artillery and armor. They positioned their strategic bombers far to the rear, confident those aircraft could operate with impunity. They invested billions in air defense networks that were supposed to detect and destroy anything that approached. Every one of those assumptions has now been exposed as fiction, not by superior numbers, not by some magical Western superweapon handed over on a silver platter, by Ukrainian ingenuity, doctrinal flexibility, and the willingness to iterate faster than the enemy could adapt. And it gets even more serious from here, because this latest operation did not appear out of nowhere. It is the culmination of a clear, escalating chronology of Ukrainian adaptation that Russia has failed to match at every turn. Go back to the summer of 2022. Russian forces were still operating under the illusion that massed artillery and traditional combined arms maneuvers would dictate the battlefield. Then Ukraine received HIMARS systems and immediately began picking apart their logistics hubs with surgical precision. Overnight, Russian command posts that had been operating in the open became kill zones. Ammunition depots that were once considered safe exploded in chains of secondary detonations. Moscow called it NATO escalation. The rest of us called it basic adaptation. By late 2022 and into 2023, Ukraine scaled up sea drones and turned the Black Sea into a no-go zone for the once proud Russian fleet. Assets that Moscow had boasted were untouchable were sent to the bottom at a fraction of the cost it took to build them. Again, the Kremlin cried foul. Again, they refused to change their doctrine. Then came the ATACMS strikes on Crimea and deeper rear areas. Russian airfields that had operated without serious threat suddenly required constant relocation of aircraft. Still, Moscow doubled down on the same rigid defensive layers, the same centralized command structure, the same refusal to admit that the character of war had fundamentally shifted toward cheaper, smarter swarming systems. Fast forward to the last 12 months, Ukraine has industrialized drone production at a scale that defies Russian imagination. They have integrated electronic warfare packages that blind even the most advanced radars. They have mastered the art of decoy swarms, low-altitude penetration, and real-time targeting using commercial and allied intelligence fused with battlefield innovation. Each of these milestones was a direct rebuttal to Russia's outdated assumptions. Each one should have forced Moscow to rewrite its playbook. Instead, they responded with the same tired rhetoric: more conscripts, more artillery shells, more threats. And now, with this latest strike on Engels and Olenia, the bill for that intellectual laziness has come due in the most spectacular way possible. What happened in those critical hours proves it doctrinally. Russia's air defense doctrine was built for a different era, for high-altitude, high-signature threats that could be tracked and engaged at long range. Ukraine flipped the script. They used waves of cheap decoy drones to saturate and exhaust the S-400 batteries. They layered in electronic jamming that degraded radar fidelity at precisely the moment the real strike package arrived. They employed low, slow, terrain-hugging flight profiles that exploited gaps Russian planners never bothered to close because their doctrine told them such threats were negligible. The result? 15 strategic bombers, aircraft critical to Russia's long-range strike and nuclear deterrence posture, taken out in a single night. That is not luck. That is doctrinal dominance. Mainstream coverage is already missing the point. You will hear analysts talk about escalation or the risk of wider war. Some will even echo the Kremlin line that Ukraine must have received direct Western targeting data. They frame it as a narrow tactical success or a one-off propaganda win. They are wrong. This was not about a single base. This was the latest confirmation that Russia cannot defend its own strategic depth. The hidden military variable here is adaptation speed. Ukraine does not need to match Russia tank for tank or missile for missile. They simply need to stay one doctrinal iteration ahead, and they are. Every month that passes widens the gap. Russian forces remain locked into a Soviet-era model of mass and centralized control. Ukrainian forces operate like a modern learning organization, decentralized, experimental, ruthless about discarding what doesn't work. Pull the lens back even further, and the industrial and state-level consequences become impossible to ignore. Those 15 bombers represent far more than lost metal. They represent months, in some cases years, of production capacity Russia can no longer easily replace. Their engine plants are already strained. Their avionics supply chains are under sanctions pressure. Every aircraft lost in this strike forces Moscow to choose between reallocating scarce resources from the front lines or further depleting strategic reserves. Meanwhile, Ukraine's drone industry is scaling exponentially. Low-cost, attritable systems are being produced by the thousands in dispersed facilities that Russia cannot effectively target. The cost asymmetry is grotesque. A single Tu-160 costs tens of millions to build and maintain. A swarm of Ukrainian drones that achieved this result cost a tiny fraction of that. This is not sustainable for Moscow, not militarily, not economically, not politically. And it gets even more serious from here because this strike directly attacks Russia's ability to project power beyond the immediate battlefield. Those strategic bombers were the backbone of their long-range conventional and nuclear options. With them burning on the tarmac at Engels and Olenia, Russia's entire theory of escalation dominance is in tatters. Their ability to threaten deep strikes against Ukrainian cities or infrastructure is now measurably degraded. Their nuclear signaling, already hollow, just lost its most visible delivery platforms. The Kremlin can scream cheated all they want. The battlefield does not care about their feelings. It only cares about who adapts. Now, let me walk you through exactly how this impossible operation actually unfolded, because the details reveal everything. The first wave was pure deception, dozens of low-signature decoys designed to trigger Russian radars and force them to commit expensive interceptors and surface-to-air missiles. While those systems were firing at ghosts, electronic warfare assets blinded the remaining coverage. Then came the main swarm, over 200 attack drones flying at treetop level, exploiting terrain masking and gaps in coverage that Russian doctrine had never anticipated. Coordinated in real time, they converged on fuel farms, maintenance hangars, and the aircraft themselves. Follow-up cruise missiles, timed to arrive in the chaos, delivered the finishing blows to hardened targets the drones could not reach. The entire sequence took less than 40 minutes from first detection to final impact. Russian response times were measured in hours. That is the difference between rigid doctrine and adaptive execution. What you are witnessing is not random. It is the predictable outcome when one military treats war as a learning competition and the other treats it as a parade of heavy equipment. Ukraine has internalized the lesson that modern conflict rewards the side that can iterate fastest. Russia has not. Their command culture still punishes initiative. Their procurement system still favors expensive legacy platforms over cheap, mass produced innovation. Their political leadership still demands victory narratives instead of honest after action reviews. This strike did not just destroy aircraft, it destroyed the illusion that Russia could ever catch up. The broader pattern it confirms is now undeniable. Since the first days of this invasion, Russia has repeatedly miscalculated the speed and creativity of Ukrainian adaptation. They assumed sanctions would cripple Kiev. They assumed the West would lose interest. They assumed their numerical advantages would prove decisive. Every single one of those assumptions has been shredded by reality. And each time Ukraine demonstrates a new capability, whether it is sea drones in the Black Sea, precision strikes on Crimea, or now this deep penetration of the strategic rear, Moscow's response is the same: denial, accusations, and zero doctrinal reform. That is not the behavior of a competent military power. That is the behavior of a system in terminal decline. Let that sink in for a moment. History will record this period as the moment when the myth of Russian military invincibility finally died. Not because of any single weapon system handed over by the West, but because Ukraine refused to fight the war Russia wanted to fight. They chose instead to fight the war that modern technology and adaptive doctrine actually reward, and they are winning that war decisively. What happens next changes everything. Russia now faces a strategic choice it has spent 2 years avoiding: admit the doctrinal failure and undertake the painful, expensive reforms required to survive, or continue doubling down on a failing model until the cumulative losses become catastrophic. Given their track record, the smart money is on the latter, which means more Ukrainian strikes like this one, more exposed vulnerabilities, more strategic assets turned into smoking wreckage. This is why I've been consistent from the beginning. The side that adapts faster wins. Ukraine is adapting. Russia is not. The evidence is burning on the runways at Engels and Olenia right now. Stay with us because those questions do not have simple answers. The next chapter in this adaptation race is already unfolding, and I will be here to break it down with the same clarity the moment it matters most. This is not over. It is only accelerating. And the next development will be even more decisive than the last.